Every so often, I get people in my DMs or messages or comments asking me about Fusion and telling me that they're a bit scared of it and that it's a little bit complicated, so they just end up not following through with the tutorials I make. So I thought, well, I should probably make a good introduction to Fusion tutorials so that you guys that are not so comfortable working on it and following tutorials can just get comfortable enough and not scared of it anymore. This video is mainly for people that have used DaVinci Resolve but have not really used Fusion at all because they're a little bit scared. But if you haven't used DaVinci Resolve at all but want to see how Fusion is and just learn a little bit about Fusion, then you can also watch this video. Maybe that'll help you transition into DaVinci Resolve after you know a little bit more about Fusion. Okay. These are the things that we're going to be covering in this video. First of all, we're going to cover the most common nodes that you're going to be using when starting out. And this is from my perspective and from what I have done and from probably it's going to be sort of like a general thing, right? And then there's going to be a little bit we're going to touch about of how connecting things works. After that, we're going to cover the basics of keyframe animations. Then we're going to cover creating masks and how they work. After that, we're going to be covering splines. And then the last thing we're going to be covering is connecting the values of different elements. Basically, a little bit about expressions. And I'm going to keep these beginner friendly. So that's going to be a little bit more intermediate, but it's pretty simple. So I'm going to actually leave that in this video because it's going to help you out when you actually want to create things, right? Okay, so let's get started with the first thing. So first thing, there's a couple of ways of creating a fusion composition. The fusion composition is basically where everything that you create inside Fusion is gonna live. Now, there are two ways of creating a fusion composition. Here if we go to the effects, and then in the effects section, you can drag these directly into your timeline, and you can also right click here and create a new fusion composition here from the media folder. The main difference is that this one is gonna be saved already here. And you can open this directly by double clicking there. And on this one, you can just right click and open this in Fusion right here, or directly click the Fusion box here while you're hovering over it. Then we can open this. Now, I was just testing things out, and for some reason, when I drag these, before I forget, what I do sometimes when I'm working on here in this one is after I've done a couple of changes, I create a backup basically by just dragging these into the media folder. And here you can just rename these, whatever the composition name is going to be. Let's call these tutorial. And I recently updated DaVinci, and in the past, whenever you change this one, what I just did here, it will automatically update the name here. For some reason, it just didn't do it right now, but it's not that big of a deal, right? So we're just gonna drag this one again here so we can have it there. Now that we're here, we're gonna go and cover the first topic of the video, which is the most common things that you're gonna be using. By most common things, I mean the nodes. These are basically the most common nodes that you're gonna be using as a beginner or when you're starting out. Basically the background here, the text, maybe the paint node, not really, and also the fast noise you're probably not gonna use as a beginner unless you're trying to explore things and just do some creative stuff. So we're gonna be using these two and also the transform node, which is not showing here, but I'm gonna show you how to add these. So the first thing we're gonna do right now is drag a background, so I'm gonna show you how it works. What I usually do is I add the background and then I make these transparent and have that as a base for the project that I'm working on. Now here you can see that there's two screens, and that is because you can also press 1 and have two, basically you can have two different nodes open at the same time. To keep things simple, I always like to work with only one unless I'm working with some 3D stuff. So yeah, we're just gonna leave these at 1 and then press 2 so that we can see the media out in here. Now, the background node is pretty straightforward. You can change the colors by moving these bars here, or just click here and you have this little normal color selection section. Now here, the image section, these as a beginner, I wouldn't recommend you to change these. By default, it's always going to be in auto resolution. And by what that means is that the fusion composition that is in the timeline is going to take the same resolution that the timeline is on, right? So that's gonna basically just copy this resolution of the timeline. If you want to make these bigger, you can just unclick these, unselect these, and then just make this bigger. But you're not gonna need that later. And then in the settings section, we have a couple of mask sections that I barely use usually. And there's the motion blur, which we're gonna cover in the last section of the video. Okay, so that was the background node. Then we're gonna drag this text node and we're gonna connect these to our background node. And here we're also jumping in a little bit into the next section, but I'm just gonna talk about the text node first. On the text node, things are pretty straightforward. If you just take a look at things here, you can already see what everything is. If you have worked in any other editor or even probably Photoshop, it looks pretty similar, I would think so. Like any text always looks like these, and we can just write the name here, the text, and here you have the different font options that you can play around with. Here we have a couple of different options here, which are moving basically the positioning of the text. You can also make these further away from your screen or closer to your screen. Then also the size, and you have the perspective, which is sort of linked to the center C here, which is basically depth or the C axis. But I don't really use this perspective much. Then you have the rotation here of the text, pretty straightforward, I would say. And you also have a background color, which will affect the whole composition if you use it. So I never really use these background. I always try to use a background here or just go to the shading section if I want to add something. I'll show you that in a second. The next one is the transform section here, which is basically the same as using a transform node. So I like to use a transform node separately, just that way it has its own individual section. It's just part of my workflow, I would say. And here in the shading section, we have a couple of numbers here. Basically what this means is that you have a couple of different layers that you can still add either on top or behind of your main text right here. If we enable these, you can see the red outline here, and it gives you a couple of different options here. And if we zoom in, we can see the text is having a red outline right here. Let me just reset the layout so we have these in the center. And here on the red outline, it's already named like that by default, but you can change this name if you want. If you go to the appearance section, you can select a couple of different things here. For example, this one is just basically a solid, but we're not seeing anything because if we go here to the position, there's a priority, and that's basically what I meant by you can make these be behind or in front of the number one. The higher the number, the closer to the screen is going to be, and the lower the number, the lower the priority. So if you put these in a perspective of like these, the lower the number, everything's going to be further away, and everything else is going to be covering it in front like that, basically. Okay, so we're going to leave these by default, and we're going to add, you can also add these box right here, the border fill, or you can leave these like these. Now, this looks pretty weird like that. So what I usually do with these boxes, I change the level from character to, you can either use text or line. If you use text, it's going to be covering every text that you have like these. So it's just going to create one big box. If you go and create these as a line, it's going to create a different box for every layer of text that you have here, for every line of text that you have here. I'm gonna go and leave these at 1, and here you can adjust the different values of the actual element that you just created. Have these little box right here, or like that. Then rotation and stuff, that's pretty straightforward. You can play around with these, and it has a pretty cool effect if you want to add, but that's basically just to play around creatively. And softness, it's adjusting the basically blurriness. It looks a little bit of blurriness, and the X value and Y value too right here. Okay, I haven't really used, I don't use these much, but if you want, you can just play around and see how it sort of adds a little bit of its own glow effect if you do that. That's actually pretty cool. I just discovered that right now because I don't use these as much in the softness section here, because there's other nodes that you can use for the actual glow effect if you want to. Okay, now that we understand the shading elements, you can also add more if you want. And they have a couple of different default ones that come here. Like for example, this one is sort of like a drop shadow that comes out. But we're just gonna leave these at to for now. Then we have the image, and is this the same as the other one? It's basically the same in all of them. And then we have the settings, which is also basically the same in all of them. Now, the next node that we're going to be using is the transform node, which is another one of the basic nodes and most common nodes that you're going to be using. And we're going to press Ctrl and spacebar, and that's going to open this selection tool menu that we have right here. And here you can find a bunch of different nodes that you can explore and see how they work. But if you just write down transform, then you can add this transform node, and it's basically going to be the same values as the one that we have seen here in the text. Now, this is pretty straightforward. I already showed you in the text how they work, but it's pretty straightforward. The only difference here is that we have this pivot point right here. If we move these, you can see this little X right here, and that is the pivot point. And what that does is basically when you adjust mostly the size and the angle and everything that's below these, basically, it's going to be taken and coming from the pivot point. What that means is if you make this smaller, you can see how it's becoming smaller towards the pivot point and also becoming bigger coming from the pivot point. If you leave these at default, it's going to be happening right from the center like that. But if we move the pivot point and we have these move the positioning of the whole thing, the pivot point is going to be remaining in the same position, basically, because I think it's because this is on top of it, so it's not really affecting anything that, so it basically affects everything that's below it, right? We're going to reset these and leave these by default. Another thing you can do is if you click here in the center, you have these little transform options. If you click one time, it's basically the positioning. If you click tab, you will see how the circle here is selected, and that is the rotation. And if you click tab once again, that's going to allow you to choose the pivot point. And you see here, transform one pivot. And you can change that manually if you want. Another thing that you can do here on the transform node is basically if you have the edges section here, and you'll find ways to use these, but it's not really that basic. If you change these to wrap and make these smaller, it basically creates clones from everything that's outside these box, basically. Then you can go duplicate. It's different, but right now, since we only have the text, it's not going to do anything. The duplicate, basically, I think it creates a dragged out version for anything that's all the way till the edges. There's also the mirror, which is basically like a mirror, so it's going to be the opposite way, so it's going to be inverted. I'm not sure when you're going to use this, but you can probably find ways to use this creatively. So we're going to just leave that as a default for now, and we're going to reset the size of these. Now that brings us to the next point, or the next topic, which is basically connecting things. As you have seen here, when I created the text node here, the first thing that happened was that a merge node came out of nowhere. It was basically created out of nowhere. Now this is also a merge node right here. So if you want to add one, you can just do that and drag this here. But by default, when you create a new connection to something, it will create a merge node unless something is connected as a mask, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. Okay. Here we have the merge node, and the merge node has three different arrows that you can see here. There's the background, which is the yellow input. There's the foreground, which is the green input. And then there's the mask, which is the blue input that we have here. When you connect something here, by default, it's going to connect something to the background usually at first. If you want to switch this up, for example, if we press Ctrl T, right now, it's going to take these as the background. So the text and transform are going to be basically the background. So if we make these colored again, like these, the background is now forward. So we're not seeing anything that's behind the background here. Okay, now that we are here, you can also see that the merge node itself has its own transform values. So that you can move these. And basically what it does is it moves anything that's coming from the foreground. So right now the background is coming from the foreground input. So if we press Ctrl T again to switch this up, you can see that right now what's moving is the text and not the background. If we go back, press T, you can see that the background is what's moving. We're gonna leave these like these for a few seconds until I'm showing, because I want to show you another thing, which is the apply mode. Basically, if you worked in Photoshop, or probably not Paint, but if you worked in Photoshop or any image editor, you can see that there's a different apply mode, and that basically means that you can play around with different style of things, and anything that's coming from the foreground is going to be affected towards the background in a different way depending on the apply mode that you're using. And you can probably find ways to use these, and this is more a little bit more creative side. It's not really normal. Basically, you're probably not going to use this much unless you're really trying to get some specific result, right? And play around with the opacity and stuff too. The operator, there's a couple of different ones too, and they have a similar effect here. Basically, the in means that anything, it's basically like a multiply, basically, right? Hello, it's the opposite. So if you want to create the mask, basically create a mask. And yeah, there's a couple of different options that you can choose from here. And it's all about playing around and exploring the tool right here. Here again, we have the same as the transform node, which is the edges here. And I'm not going to go again over it because you already, I would say that you're familiar with it already. Now here, there's a good thing, important thing is the blend mode. What this does is basically can decide whether the foreground is going to be completely showing if it's in one, or it's going to be transparent. So it's not going to take into account anything that's coming from the foreground input, which is the green one. So you can use these sometimes to deactivate things or to show things in your animation if you want to. If you want to leave these a little bit more opaque, you can just leave these around like 50% or something like that. Right now, we're just going to leave this at 1, and I'm going to go and reset these to 0 so the background is transparent again, so that we can jump into the next point, which is going to be the animation. If you're working on Resolve the first time, you've probably wondered what these little squares here or little boxes here are. And these are basically the keyframe generators. If we click these here, it's going to create a keyframe where the pointer here we have, where the timeline bar here is shown, right? If we click another one right here, it's also going to create another point. And now you have the in point or out point or middle point if you add more later on. Now, another thing you have to know is that when you have one keyframe activated, if you go a couple frames forward and you make a change here, for example, if you make this bigger, a keyframe is going to be added automatically. So you have to be careful with that if you have a lot of keyframes going on, because if you make a change and you're not in the correct one, then can mess up your animations. For in this specific case, we're gonna create something basic. So we're gonna bring these at 24 and we're gonna create the position. Now, as you have seen here, that I'm using the transform node to move everything in the text. Now, this is basically a matter of personal preference. You can also do that here in the text, but I find it simpler to go here right directly to the transform instead of having to go to the text, because sometimes you might want to change something in the text and having to find things here again, it gets a little bit complicated. So it's just a thing that a part of my workflow that I ended up using, right? So if we can rename these so that we know what the specific transform or animation is coming from. So if we press F2 on the node with the node selected, we can just name these text transform animation. It's a little bit long, but just for the tutorial's sake, you can see how the name changed right here. Now that we have these two keyframes here, we can go to the 0. I usually like to create two keyframes with the same values and leave the second one be the ending point, so where we want this to end. So we're gonna actually create another animation here with the center, which is basically means the position. And you can make these become a little bit lower or come from off screen. If you press play right here, you've created your first animation if you haven't done so already in Fusion. But you can see this here like that. And it's a linear animation. And we're gonna cover about how to make these a little bit smoother and cooler with the splines in a little bit. So keep watching if you wanna learn how to do that. Now that we have these here, you can see that these created a path here. If we go here to the modifier, you can see the path has been created. This is a little bit more intermediate, I would say, so I'm not gonna cover these in this video. So we're gonna go back to the tools here, and I wanna just tell you one thing, that here you can see these green stuff, which is basically the path that we have. And if you click this here, you can actually move these around, either with your arrow keys here. If you press shift, you can make these come from like closer or adjust the position, holding shift and the arrow keys. That way you can already see where the position is, right? And one thing that you gotta know is that if you make these changes from the path right here, like this, it's not gonna create a new keyframe because you're basically selecting this keyframe here, which is the same as having the position right here and then moving this like that. As you can see here, if we move these, you can already see how the positioning is taking that into account. And you can see here on your screen how it changes also the values here. And if we have the positioning or the time bar and we make this, you can also see the positioning changing, but it's not creating a new keyframe. So that is basically how paths work in the animation. Now that we have that there, I'm gonna show you one thing, which is creating, you can make these a little bit smaller too, just so we have another thing happening at the same time. Like that. You can see how it becomes a little bit bigger as it comes into the screen. Okay, now I'm gonna show you a little bit about masks next, and then we're gonna be coming back into the keyframes so that I can explain something to you and it will make sense. Now you can see all these blue points. Pretty much all nodes have these blue points, and as I mentioned, those are the masks. There's a couple of different ways to create masks. There's these 4 right here, basically the rectangle. If you add these, it's gonna create a rectangle, and anything that has the rectangle that's happening inside the rectangle will be shown. Or if you invert this, anything that's happening inside the rectangle or that's coming into a rectangle is not gonna be shown in your animation, right? So if we create, you can also create a circle or an ellipse, and you can also create or draw your own animation by using the polygon or the B-spline tools. We create the B-spline, basically it creates a little bit more dynamic or organic shape. And if we go to the polygon, it's a little bit more straight, but you also have there are different like options here to make things smooth. Like here, for example, you press Shift 5, and with all of the points selected, you can see how it creates a maybe a little bit more organic, but not as much as the B-spline, right? But you have a little bit more control when you're working with a polygon like this. So those are the different types of masks that you can use, and they also have their own controllers here, like the transform and such, pretty much similar to all the other nodes, but that is basically how they work. So we're gonna go and add a mask here, and we're gonna connect these to the merge node in this case, but it's gonna have the same effect if you connect these to the text or to the transform. Now, if you connect these to the text right now, nothing's really is gonna happen because we haven't really moved the text. If we move the text here, then it will show up it will have an effect. But since we have animated using the transform, we can see how the animation is only showing when it's happening inside the transform. But to keep things a little bit more organized and simple, I like to use these usually in the merge nodes. So we're gonna go and see how this works. Now these masks, one thing that you can do if you're working with masks is instead of having the edge being that sharp, you can adjust the soft edge right here. And that's gonna make it a little bit soft so that it shows up a little bit better and it's not that sharp as I mentioned, right? It's in the name. Okay, now that we have that, you can play around with the size of these, positioning, and basically anything like that. Also, you can invert these, and that means that if the text is going like that, then it's gonna be disappearing once it gets to the position of the rectangle mask. Okay, now that you understand how the mask works, it's pretty straightforward basically, right? You can either use it to show something only in that container or to not show something when it's coming into that container. Since we have these here and we also have the merge node, what I wanted to show you one thing here is I mentioned a little bit earlier the blending mode, and instead of using a mask here for this animation, if you want to make these look a little bit better, if you want something to disappear like that, what you can do is also use the blending mode to animate these. So we're going to take the same amount of keyframes here, and we're going to create a blend keyframe, and also go to 0 and make these 0. You can now, if we press play now, you can see how it's sort of showing up like that. Now the path of these is a little bit too far away, right? So if we go here and move our path, it's gonna look a lot better like that. It's a little bit slow because it's a linear animation, but I'm gonna show you that in the spline when we're covering the spline topic in a little bit. You can also create the individual keyframes to the shading elements here. If we go back to the 2, for example, you can add keyframe animations to pretty much everything. It's all about playing around. Like for example, if you want the box to start a lot wider, you can also make these go to 5. It's really up to you. But you can also add a keyframe for these, and it will add a little bit of a special touch to your animation if you want to play around with those details. But since we have these here like that, oh, okay, before I forget, there's a couple of different things. We're gonna be coming back into animation because I want to show you how to create the outro animation if you want to basically clone these. But we're gonna be covering the splines first, and then we're gonna be coming back to these in a little bit. So if you want to create a spline, you can see here the spline tool opens, and by default it's gonna be showing everything, usually all your nodes that have keyframes here, and nothing has a keyframe in the text, so it's not gonna show. But if we have this selected like these and click show only selected, I usually use these like these because if you have a lot of different nodes and you have different keyframes, it can open a lot of them, and it gets a little bit complicated if you have way too many of them. We can click this little box with the 2 arrows here to zoom to fit, it says, and that means that it's gonna bring everything closer to your screen so that we can see how it works and see what's happening. So this is the linear animation, as we can see here. There's a couple of different tools here that we can use. The step in and step out are 2 that I barely use. Basically, it's just basically like showing up. It doesn't really do much. It's just like a jump cut, basically. Now you can click the smooth animation here to make these to make the curves smoother, or you can just simply select these and press F and also S. There's a difference between F and S. The S is when you're working with different animations, if you have more animations. Let me just add another one so I can show you here. We're gonna go to the transform and add a second size animation. So we're gonna fit everything on our screen again. If we press S, you see how the curve sort of continues, and it's a little bit more organic. If you press F, it ends in a little bit more of like a straight line here, so it creates a little bit more of a pause when you're working with the F animation, like the F curve. We're gonna be using the F in this case. When you have these, you can see there's a couple of different things that happen here when you have everything selected. You have these curve handles that you can use to adjust the curvature. This is not as accurate, and it becomes a little bit tedious sometimes because of that. So what I like to do is I select everything and then I press T, and that is allowing us to choose the ease in and ease out options in a more organized and accurate way, I would say, like these. And if we press play, we can see how the animation is a lot better and it looks a lot cooler than a straight animation right here. You can see how it looks pretty nice, pretty good animation. Now that we have those animations, let me just touch upon these other tools that you have here. There's the reverse, which is what we're going to be using to create our outro animation in a little bit, which basically just, as the name says, it reverses the animation. There's the set loop, which is useful to create loop animations. And usually when you're working with a loop animation, I would usually use like a straight line or like a linear animation of keyframes because that's how it looks a little bit better. But it really depends, right? If you can see here how the loop works, it basically restarts it. Then you have the ping pong, which is if you want to keep something looping also, but just as the name says ping pong, it comes in and comes out. And then the last one is the set relative. What that means is basically it creates and makes the animation keep going on a way up. Basically, as you can see here, as the stairs, it comes in and then goes a little bit higher and then comes off screen. I never really used that one before until I was recording these for the first time, and then the audio got messed up. So I'm recording these a second time. But yeah, the set relative is pretty cool, and I'm probably gonna try to use it in a couple more animations in the future. Now there's this select all here that you can click to select everything that's on screen, but the shortcut for that one is Control A, and that's what I do usually. I just press Control A, and then you can click append. I don't really use these because it gets a little bit weird and crazy, so I don't really use that. And it basically is to create new points, but if you go over these already, you can create a new keyframe, like as you can see here. So yeah. Then you have this one, which is this time stretch. And what that does is if you have selected everything and click that, it creates sort of like a box that you can now stretch to the side. And it basically, as the name says, it creates a time stretch for the whole animation. Then you have this shape box, which allows you to create a similar box. And then you can do the same basically, or make these higher like that. If you look at these, then it looks like that. There's a lot of ways to break your animations, right? Okay, so we're gonna deselect these. And then the last one is the show keyframe markers, which is showing you the keyframes right here up on top of your little box, splines tool section here. If you have a point, selected a point here, you can select what you want it to show, time scale, time offset, or the value of the offset right here. Depending on which animation or which keyframe you're working with, it will show up either here in the time section or the value offset or scale right on the right side right here. So yeah, that is basically how splines work. And there's a lot of ways to play around with these and to make things look pretty interesting with these. And it's definitely something you will be using a lot as you create more animations here. Okay, now that we have that, we're gonna go back into the keyframe animation so that I can show you how to create the outro of this animation. And if we go here to the last keyframe, and if we know that we have used 24 frames, and we want these to go out in the same amount of frames that we have used, what we're gonna do is we're gonna press -24 or subtract 24 keyframes for here, 24 frames, and we're gonna be creating the copy of our animation here. You can select everything, and holding Control, you can drag these and then set that first point there, and we can verify this correctly by just moving it a little bit. And we're gonna select that, and we're gonna use the reverse option that I just showed you, and that's gonna be creating the outro animation right here that we have. Now, in between here, you can add more animations if you want, but there's one thing you have to take into account, which is a little bit more advanced, but I'm gonna show you either ways just so that you are aware of it. If you drag this fusion composition, you can make these longer in your timeline. But by just dragging these, it's not gonna do much because the animation keyframes have already been set at these frames. If you want, you can select everything, go to the splines and select these and drag these all the way till the end. But that can be a little bit complicated unless you're working specifically with a lot more animations happening right in the middle. There's a node, so I'm gonna reset the duration to 5 by default. I'm going to Fusion. Here, we select these. There's a special node that's called the keyframe stretcher, which we're gonna use, and I'm gonna show you just a little bit, just so that you know. Keyframe stretcher, which I use a lot for the templates when I create templates. Basically, what this does is it takes into account the fusion composition that you have here, And you can set the keyframe stretcher right here. As you can see, by default, it's already at 24 and 96. And what you want to do is select the keyframes that you have. So we have 24 and the stretch start is going to start at 24. If we go back and have these 96, 95, then we're going to put these 95 right here. And if we now stretch these, you can see how it goes in and then it lasts longer because everything that's in between is being stretched, and then it goes out right at the end. Now, I mentioned that if you have animations happening right in between here in the middle, if you have things happening right here, they will be slowed down because everything that's happening between those 2 points is going to be stretched. So that's when you want to be careful with the keyframe stretcher. This is a little bit more intermediate, maybe not really advanced, but intermediate, well, just to know how to use it. But I just wanted to let you know so that because you probably will have that question when you're creating something, right? Okay, so that is the keyframe stretcher. Let me just get rid of that for now because we're just going to be using the default. Now we have the animation basically ready. We have the mask. We already know how everything works in that regard. Now, the last topic that we are going to be covering is the connecting values of elements. Earlier in the video, I mentioned the motion blur in the settings section, right? What I like to do usually is if you have different elements and you add motion blur to the animation, it makes it look a little bit better. Let me just show you right now with the transform animation right here. You can see how when you press play, it adds a little bit of a special touch when you are just using a motion, when you have the motion blur activated versus when you don't. And this is a matter of preference, so you don't have to use it. But what I do, I usually like to lower the shutter angle so it doesn't look that. So the effect is a little more subtle. Now, if we were to have another animation here, let's say we want to animate the color of this box changing. Let's go to the shading and then element number 2. We're going to create a keyframe in the color at 0. And then at 24, it's going to be another color. And I'm doing this quickly just so that I can explain this next point about connecting values. Since everything has a motion blur here, what I like to do is I like to convert everything and connect things so that I can make change to one motion blur and the same thing is happening to all of them. So if we want to have the merge one be the motion blur, let's say control, let's call this control, and we have activated these, what we can do is create a pane right here. And now when we unselect this is going to stay open. If we go to the transform that we have here and we go to the motion blur, we can actually just right click here on the quality, for example, and we can create an expression. You can here name the merge one. You can create these by typing the name or by basically just clicking this plus button right here and dragging these into the quality. Now be careful because if you drag these into another one, it's going to take the value of whatever you have dragged it into, and that's a way to break things or to at least make them not look as you want it to. Okay, here you can see create another copy. So let me just delete that and we're going to use this quality, merge one.quality. Now if you like typing things, what you can do here is write merge one dot and then the name of the element. So it's going to be shadow angle, and that's going to be creating. Now, if you right click here and create an expression, and let's say you have misspelled something, let's say center, you have added another S. If you misspell things, it's not going to work. And usually it will show red here in your notes if it is an important element. So if you make changes here in the center bias, it's not going to be affected because it's not the right name, right? So we're going to go and connect these here to the center bias. And yeah, so now I didn't mention it, but as you have probably seen, any changes that we are making in this merge node is already being applied to the transform that we have right here. And after you have all of them connected, the last thing that you want to do is right click on the transform and then create an expression here for the motion blur. And then here, you can just connect the motion blur to this one. What that does is that when we activate here the motion blur, then it's also going to be activating in the transform node. And if we click again, then it's going to be activating it and deactivating it, depending on what you do. So now everything is connected, right? All those values are connected. What if you have more than one thing that you want to connect? Going through that process from every time from like, if you have a lot of nodes, going through that process can become a little bit tiring and tedious. So I discovered not long ago a good and easy way to fix this. So what you want to do is select the transform here that we have, and we're going to press Ctrl+C to copy, or right click if you want to do that. And we're going to go to the text because we have a couple of animations that we just created here in the text, and we want to connect the motion blur. What we can do here is we can right click and then paste settings. What this does is it basically creates a copy of whatever you have copied, and these from this node. If you go back to the settings, you can see that we do have to do these for all of them, but it's a little bit faster than having to create either typing or connecting the arrow with this little plus button right here. And we paste the settings again. Now we deactivate these, everything's going to be deactivated. And if we activate these, then we can see that everything has the same motion blur connected to this element. So yeah, that is basically how you connect things. And I think we have covered pretty much everything in this video for you to be able to work your first animations and to get comfortable enough with Fusion. If you have any doubts, you can also just write them down in the comments, or you can just go over the video once again and just check it out and see what you have missed. We have covered the most basic nodes that you're going to be used. We've covered how connecting things work, basically the merge nodes. We have also covered the keyframe animations, how to add the intro and outro animation. Then we also went over the masks, the splines, and lastly, what we just did, which was connecting things with simple expressions. Now, I hope this video is helpful in making you less scared of Fusion. Whoops. I keep hitting this mic thing here. But yeah, hopefully you have learned something new, and hopefully you're a lot less scared from Fusion, and that you can start creating your own cool animations. Now, if you have enjoyed this video and you have found this helpful, you can give it a like or leave a comment saying what you have liked or what you have not liked from this video, so that I can just go over it and just see what the feedback is, right? So yeah, I'd love to hear your feedback, and I hope to see you in the next video here in SUALVI. Bye.